Thank you for attending our Hiring a Data Analyst webinar. So I'm just going to introduce everybody here in a second, but basically we're going to let our panelists speak, and then towards the end we are going to have the opportunity for a Q&A. There is a Q&A feature through Zoom, so if you have any questions, please feel free to add those there and we'll try to get to everybody. So on our panel today we have Kevin Novak. Kevin is the founder and managing partner at Rackhouse Venture Capital, a new early stage fund that invests in data and AI companies at their earliest stages. Before that, he spent 15 years working as a data scientist and data executive, including as chief data officer at Tala Financial and the first head of data science at Uber. Our next panelist is Colin Zima. He is the director of product at Google Cloud and the former chief analytics officer and VP of strategy at Looker. During his time at Looker, Colin has led product analytics, customer success, support, and strategy. Prior to Looker, Colin served as the director of data science and business intelligence at Hotel Tonight, which he joined through the acquisition of his startup, Primatable. Prior to founding Primatable, Colin spent several years as a statistician at Google in search ranking and as a synthetic credit structurer at UBS. Next, we have Jess Kirkpatrick. Jess has been working as a data scientist in the tech industry for the past 10 years. Her previous companies include Microsoft, Chegg, Hired, and Slack. She was the first data scientist at two early stage startups where she was responsible for building out the data science organization and strategy. And she is currently a data science manager at thredUP. And then finally, Peter Fishman, the CEO and co-founder of Mozart Data. He has over a decade of experience running data and data adjacent teams at startups in a variety of industries, including gaming, social, HR and benefits, real estate, and cannabis. When he realized that he was building the same types of modern data stacks at each company, he teamed up with a close friend to start Mozart Data in 2020 and make it easy for anyone to gather data, automate reporting, and generate insights. He also co-founded Bacon Hot Sauce in 2010, which sold hundreds of thousands of bottles of hot sauce. And now I will pass it over to Fish.
Yeah, sadly, we didn't have a really great data team at Bacon Hot Sauce, but now I get to make up for lost time working at Mozart Data. I'm really excited to have this panel here with us, a bunch of data celebrities in my eyes, and I think it should be a good conversation. One of the questions we keep hearing at Mozart Data is really like all variants of how to make that first data hire. Everybody now, everybody the last decade has been talking about data as really essential, as like the new oil, etc. But one of the things that's just sort of constantly evolving is sort of the supply and demand of really sort of data savvy folks, and then how one applies them in early stage companies, then also obviously in late stage companies. But I'm really focused on how you make that first sort of analytics hire, typically more at either early stage companies, but now you see that earlier and earlier and earlier. So I think we have a good set of perspectives, and I just want to dive in and just start to have a conversation around it and get the different ideas flowing about sort of anything sort of about that first data hire or anything adjacent to it. So maybe we could just start by even just talking about what are the types of problems you see at early stage companies where data is relevant. I mean, often, some of these companies today are on the verge of having collected very little amounts of data before they even really think that they need to sort of wrangle it and figure out some optimizations. But what are the types of questions that these folks might be answering in the first place? Because I think that sort of informs kind of who you're looking for. So maybe Jess, you could kick us off.
Sure, thanks. So yeah, you bring up a really good point that it's challenging to know when to hire someone when you have a product that doesn't have a lot of data. That said, I do think there's a lot of things you can think about even in the alpha or beta stage where you're just testing a system in terms of the design of how you want to architect your data, in terms of understanding pain points or inefficiencies, and really like starting to have the culture within the organization of thinking about data first as you are designing your product. And so having somebody who is not just wanting to take large sets of numbers and do models, but really like passionate and interested about how to create frameworks and systems that will scale as you get more data, and trying to understand what's working and not working, even at the very beginning stages where you don't have a ton of volume.
And obviously, Colin, you must encounter this, or have encountered this, sort of having worked in BI. You know, what is it that, you know, these folks would be answering, reporting on it from an early perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most, to go back to even the previous question, the most important thing is just that you have data to look at to start. So you need to have some area where you're actually collecting data. I think we actually see that it varies depending on the type of product or service. So if you're a media company and you're putting out content, the most important data that you're collecting is just web traffic for that sort of content that you're putting out, which is sort of self-obvious. Similarly, if you're doing something that's more e-commerce-y, a lot of what you're going to be looking at is either some sort of purchase funnel or some sort of operational understanding of how products are getting made. So I really think the best way to frame sort of building an early data team is actually just enhancing some area of the business. We usually see pull. Maybe it's from a marketing organization, maybe it's from a product organization, maybe it's from a finance organization. But the data team, rather than being sort of the classic global data team, tends to essentially be a person that's answering questions for a leader in one of those areas. So we're starting to spend a bunch of money on Instagram and Facebook marketing. What's it doing? That tends to be the first type of data question that we see a lot of people trying to attack.
Yeah,
Kevin,
I think that's right.
Did you enhance any decision making back in the day when you were at Uber starting a data team?
Pete, was that at me or at Colin?
Yeah, that was at you, Kevin.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it that you sort of see, I spend most of my day job these days working with founders at like Series A and earlier companies, and you kind of see like the two quintessential problems. Less common, but actually more common in my operating experience, was like the embedded machine learning scientist or data scientist, where some core product feature, even at the MVP stage, is like AI or ML derived, or sort of a hard data function. And so, I mean, the most obvious example of my operating career was Uber and its dispatching system, right? That we kind of, even from, you know, the point that there were 10 cars on the road, we're trying to build these decisioning systems that say, okay, you know, given this set of customers who would like rides and this set of available cars, how do we connect customers and riders, right? That, you know, I would say is, the title of it is very sort of throughout my career. Some people call them ML engineers, some people call them product data scientists, but like that is undeniably a quintessential thing. The other, which I think is far more universal need, is exactly what Colin was touching on. You know, at the earliest stages of building your company, you are chasing product market fit, right? It's like, how do we get the largest number of people paying, you know, the fairest price possible for this product? And that oftentimes almost never happens organically. It requires some amount of experimentation. Sometimes it's not even as rigorous as an experiment, but it's sort of, like you said, I'm spending money on Facebook ads. How are we doing? Like, is this even a good idea? Am I throwing good money after bad? You know, who are the people who are using my product, and what are the sort of attributes that, can we find any commonalities in them that suggest sort of the next set of features we want to pursue? You know, all of that is sort of a very classic data analysis, at least at the earliest stages.
Colin, I want to go back to your answer. If the challenge is improving some like part of an organization, does that mean the first data person is typically not a data person per se?
I think a little bit. Like, it depends on what you mean by a data person, because it's like a self-referential problem. But like,
Sure.
very often the first person that is doing data analysis is someone that's job does not have data in the title. So in the marketing example, you've hired someone to do performance marketing. That person is doing data analysis at some level. Like they want to know how many clicks they're getting on their Facebook ads or their Google ads, and they're doing analysis. And some of those people evolve into data people over time. And sometimes they are very good at ad placement or sort of finding inventory, sort of exploiting that function. And they need support in sort of improving those decisions or connecting it to the rest of the business. In my experience at Hotel Tonight, for example, like a lot of people don't realize that we were ranking hotels by hand for a really long period of time. It was like truly people behind the curtain ranking hotels. But you sort of are, the market managers were doing some form of data analysis to do that. Like they're trying to choose the best things and put them up there. And data is just enhancing their jobs. And actually the first data person at Hotel Tonight was a market manager who sort of gravitated towards that experience and then could scale herself across all the other market managers. So I do think frequently it's someone in operations or product or marketing or finance that is trying to answer questions in a more structured way and sort of start to formalize how things work, like maybe move it out of a spreadsheet into something more scalable.
Yeah, and is the next step there, you know, and I'll sort of throw this more towards Jessica, you know, who's built a lot of these early teams, but is the next step there to train that finance person? Like, you know, if you were the CTO or CEO of a company, is it to train that finance person up in some of sort of the maybe the core or basic data infrastructure, as well as like basic, you know, data analysis? Or is it that's, you know, that's when you're going to spend the money and, you know, hire that data person? Like, again, I still am in the when stage.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on the resources an organization has and the personnel, and if they're interested in stepping into that role and expanding. I have seen that at some organizations, when you have a product or marketing leader who is like, you know, interested in learning and figuring out best practices and stepping into that role, it can be done by somebody who's existing in the company. I've also seen it be done wrong. And then when a data person gets brought in a year later, there's a lot of like mess to clean up, where it would have probably been better to bring in somebody sooner who could have kind of had the forethought of like, where is this going and how can we build this out in a way that will last for several years versus having to redo it in 6 months. So I mean,
what is that tax? Like, what does that look like? Like, is it that the tables are kind of silly or disorganized, or there's like an analysis gone wrong that's like pointing the company in the wrong direction? What is the tax there?
I mean, I've only seen, if I think that maybe like Colin would have more experience with the ways that this looks through like his work at Looker, but yeah, I've seen it as that systems are very like become very tedious to do analysis. There's not like a thought about how to aggregate tables in a way that is like organized, and there's data that's mistracked, or things just keep having to get added, which causes a lot of confusion. Things break. There aren't good forms of communication between the engineering team and people downstream that are going to be doing analysis. So things like that is what I've seen.
Great. I do want to move on to the sort of meat of today's conversation, which is, what are you really looking for when you're hiring that first data person? You know, I do want to get into the, you know, sort of standard, what are the standard sort of hard skills? What are the standard soft skills? You know, let's dive in there and find the points of disagreement, but let's just get started. What are sort of your minimum hard skills, or are there any? You know, it's, you know, I think, so maybe Kevin, you could start us when you think about kind of some early teams. What are the minimum hard skills you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so generally speaking, the kind of qualitative goal I'm looking for from somebody is, do they have enough breadth of skills that they could do the entire analysis workflow without requiring having a hard dependence on a significant number of other members of the team. Just when you're thinking early, you've got a bunch of stuff to do. You know, ideally you want collaboration, but you know, the ability to work without dependencies generally leads to more work getting done. So for me, in most of my experience on the technical skills, you know, for your first analysis, almost no coding experience, like obviously some light scripting, maybe R, something that would enable them to leverage like the best aspects of programming languages to do scalable work. But almost never am I looking for somebody who needs to like embed in an engineering team. You know, this is not somebody who's like trusted to commit code to production, like that level. That's overkill. On the quantitative skills, I always had this very sort of moving bar of, I always want to sort of consistently hire like the most quantitatively intelligent person in the company, right? So I less think of it as an objective bar, and it's always more of a distribution of, is this person trusted to hire to handle the most analytically hard end of the set of problems we're wrestling with right now? And the subtlety to that is, of course, over time, the set of problems you're addressing, the level of sophistication is going to go up. And so if you just kind of have this moving bar of like, are they like 95th percentile of the quantitative skills of the set of human beings in the company right now, it's generally scaled up with me pretty well through like my first 10 or 20 hires. And then maybe the most important skill for the first hire for an analyst is world-class communication, right? That so much of this role of this person sort of interpersonally is coaching up every other member of the company on like, here's what data is, here's how you use it, you know, here are some like plausible sounding but bad anti-patterns you guys are in that I need to fix. And so if they can't sort of handle the ability to, you know, get their ideas across to an audience that is probably very smart, but maybe not on the axes of sort of analysis like they are, has to be one of the skills you look for in those early hires.
Yeah. So minimum hard skill, Kevin instantly goes to communication. Love it. Second thing is, I love also the image of a JD where it's like you need to be 2 standard deviations to the right of the mean of our company in terms of quantitative thinking. So I'm not quite sure. What is that? What does that actually look like on a? You know, it's like, it's funny. You can't like. I think I agree. Like that's definitely something you want, and I think it's like the right answer. I'm like, I wonder how that translates into a JD. Other than
honestly, I mean, what I would do is in the early process, you have this basic like skills check of like, you know, you have like a standard set of probability questions, and it's sort of so, or standard set of data analysis questions I think are so standardized that you could just find it on a Google search. But as you get to the later end of the spectrum, honestly, the way we assess that is we bring them in the on-site interview, right? And I literally, it's not unheard of for me to be like wrestling with a problem, and I just like walk into an on-site with a candidate, give them a quick 5 or 10 minute crash course on like whatever the problem du jour happens to be, and then let's just like collaboratively work on this problem together, right? And if I feel like in 60 minutes, like you have to condition this on like, okay, they've had all of 10 minutes of training, but if I feel like given that they've meaningfully advanced like my understanding of the problem, you know, massive positive signal. And by the way, it's a great way to sell a candidate you really like on the company, right? You're actually bringing them into like the problem of the week. You know, they get a lot more of a sort of tactical feel of, you know, what are the types of things we're working on.
Colin, if you sort of think about, you know, obviously you've interviewed in a lot of contexts. Yep. If you know, same question to you, which is sort of, what are the sort of minimum sort of hard skills that
so I think the first thing is that I've seen sort of 2 very distinct styles of the first data person, and I think depending on which of the 2 routes that you take, it does differ a little bit. In some cases, you're hiring the person that's going to be the data leader, and you're hiring someone that is capable of being an IC that's really effective, but is going to grow into building the data team. So like you're hiring the data manager that's going to build the team. I've also seen a lot of cases where you're hiring a relatively junior person, you're getting some data fluency for the organization with an expectation that you'll bring in a team above and around that person. So like talking about the more junior role, I would sort of echo all the same things. Like communication is really important. I'm looking for like statistical fluency. So again, like an ability to understand quantitative. And I'm super biased here because sort of my first data experiences were Excel. And I think the ability to understand how SQL works and how data relationships work is really important, but the ability to actually write SQL, I think, is less important because that can be learned. The harder aspect I've seen, especially for the junior folks, is sort of an ability to contextualize what you're doing. Like, how does the business work? How should the marketing team be looking at data? How can I help that person? So like, I really like the consultant profile, the sort of the person that was doing something relatively businessy that is numbers related, I think makes a very good sort of junior first hire. On the other side, I think you want to find someone who is a high level contributor that is capable of being a leader. And I think the most effective hire is if you can find that person that you know can go hire the next 5 people and lead a team that also maybe just wants to get a little dirtier in the data and sort of misses doing real work and not leading teams. Like, those people can be incredibly effective because they're going to bring a wealth of experience, and you're sort of over hiring, but it's going to make like the next 5 people that much easier. So I think both of those strategies can work, and it sort of depends on like, how much investment do I want to put in right now? Like, am I over hiring a little bit, or am I just sort of trying to get the data thing rolling?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's an important question. How do you know if you're in camp 1 or camp 2? Like, how do you know? I mean, and maybe this is sort of organizationally, and it, you know, could apply to hiring a marketing person or hiring a salesperson or hiring, you know, whatever it is. How do you know if you're in the camp of like, we really want like a data leader, and we want to like slightly overhire and hope that they miss kind of the joys of you know, grinding away?
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to sort of the leadership team and how much they're expecting the person to contribute. So I think there are a lot of organizations where it's like you're sort of trying to build a lightweight reporting function. Like, you're not like, we need data to optimize our business. You're sort of just like, we want to start formalizing this a little bit. I think those people tend to lean towards sort of the more junior person, which is like, let's just get this moving and show people that it's valuable. And the leader will come in and sort of advocate for a data org down the line. I think there are other ones that have either worked with really great data people or sort of appreciate the hole that might exist, that are more ready to hire that person. But I think it's sort of, at least in my experience, it's sort of just been some expectation that you need that person is really important if you're going to hire someone more senior. I think otherwise the more junior person is going to sort of pull in the value of data. But that's a really hard question. Maybe the other folks have better thoughts here.
Well, I want to pick up on another thread that you had started, which is basically like, you know, a standard, you know, a prototype, you know, of a person, you know, sometimes like me, like a failed academic. I had done a lot of statistics in my PhD, and I just want to apply it to an adjacent field. The flip is like, you know, a Excel savvy consultant, which understands like literally like concepts like joins as lookups, but like it's the same, it's truly the same idea. You know, not that these are, you know, sometimes there's a Venn diagram where some people fall in both of these categories, but if you had to kind of think about those two in an early stage, are these exclusively the types of profiles you look for? Are you looking for other people that maybe have data analyst experience or data scientist experience? Jess, how do you think about like those 3 prototypes as you're building out your teams?
Yeah, so I have a bias as well coming from academia, and I have hired a lot of folks that are transitioning from harder science into data science. I think those folks tend to be really good at problem solving and digging into problems. They might not be as good at the kind of like doing something at an MVP level, stopping and then like making a decision off of it, which is often what is needed at a very small company. And so whereas the consultant type is more kind of trained to like do that quick sort of like turnaround, make actionable decisions, but maybe won't have as much experience in the like in breadth and like the deep statistical analysis that will be important as you kind of get more experimentation platforms going. So, I mean, I would, I guess if for my very first data hire, would probably lean more towards the consultant type, because you don't have as much like huge data sets to do a lot of deep statistics on, unless you, as Kevin was saying, are building out a machine learning and AI part of your product. And then you would want someone who had more data science experience. I think that the academic type, with no data science experience or industry experience, can be really effective and very smart and inexpensive, but usually needs some mentorship on some of that communication, prioritization, and kind of influencing skills that are really important to get your analysis implemented in an organization.
I'm sort of a fan of being really opportunistic here and looking at, honestly, like what you're looking for is maybe, like you said, like a business consultant or biz ops or somebody that's had an adjacent, like to a data role that you really believe can pick up, SQL, tech lingo, those types of problems. Or you're looking for an academic that like knows how to, solve things to the, the 10th decimal point, and then, but actually has that propensity. Are there any kind, I mean, obviously, Kevin, you've made a lot of these hires in the past. Like, are there any kind of signals that you like for either that like each of that type has that aptitude for that next step?
Yeah, I was going to say the other archetype we haven't discussed that I do think has made massive success as I was building teams is sort of the mid-career pivot into data, that you find people who are 5, 7, 8 years into some other vertical, usually in the tech field, and they kind of stopped, maybe took a boot camp or sort of had a little bit of like a mid-career academic training and then jumped in. And why I love those people, I mean, there is a risk of, the other person who fits that pattern is more of like a dilettante that you kind of have to look for, and it's just somebody who just like doesn't like to commit to anything. But for the people who are doing it successfully, what I love about it is that they were consciously, maybe 2 or 3 rungs up a career ladder, stopped, like thought deeply about like what motivates them in the workplace, and like very consciously opted into data, which means like the baseline enthusiasm and grit and sort of, willing to, they deeply love the domain. I think that grittiness and enthusiasm is what I always tend to look for in every hire, regardless of this. And you tend to find it a lot in these sort of mid-career pivot folks. Same thing with academics, right? Pete, you mentioned you're a failed academic. I am a failed academic. I literally, when I was like hiring for data folks, would go to these more hardcore academic conferences and like look for the people who looked a little miserable to be there. Like where they're doing it because their advisor told them to, and it's kind of like something that they're there kind of low key against their will. Because if you had like enough strength to get, to like defend a, quantum chemistry PhD, like you obviously have the underlying analytical skills necessary, but your mindset is so much better aligned for industry than academia. So definitely, in that, all of that kind of speaks to the willingness to just kind of push through and execute and grittiness, because the first few years of building a data team, maybe the first 18 months, is mostly just execution, right? There's sort of a baseline idea of like, okay, here's what we need to do, where most of the sort of next steps are relatively obvious. And it just comes down to like laying down, your first 1,000 analyses, your first couple dozen SQL tables. And that requires motivation, because at some point you're about 2/3 of the way through and you're just, doing it to get it done, right? The novelty is worn off, and now it's just kind of finishing out what you started.
So I want to, I sort of, there's like a lot of like a agreement and a hint with a hint of disagreement in these answers. I want to ask the audience just a quick reminder. Feel free to interrupt, throw questions in the Q&A, and we'll have some time at the end for that. But that sort of leads me to, given kind of these profiles, I do want to get into the nitty gritty of how you go about actually making that hire. So the two dimensions are how you source that hire and then how you filter effectively what you source. Let's go in reverse order of the intuitive funnel. I would love to know the types of questions you love to ask folks. And I would start with Jessica, I think, who has the most relevant experience building out these teams. What are the I mean, not what are your exact interview questions, but what are the things that you ask that you intentionally sort on?
Yeah, so I've moved away from giving brain teasers or statistical problems, which I did do many years ago, to trying to find problems like Kevin talked about that I'm currently thinking about, and try to pretend that we are collaborating on that problem and see how someone takes from a very kind of baseline little bit of information, can run with that, ask the right questions, figure out what are the areas where they could actually move the knowledge forward. Because I tend to be able to more easily understand what it'd be like to work with that person. And then the other thing that I like to do is try to pick on something that they are an expert on already and see how well they can explain that to me and how deep we can go into that before they sort of run out of giving me new information. Because sometimes people are not as good at thinking on their feet of something that they've never thought about before, but they would be great colleagues in terms of if they had a little bit more time to reflect. But if it is something they've thought about before, then they're really good at digging in and helping you understand how to think about it in an analytical way.
Yeah, I do want to I sort of want to get, to the extent we can get analytical about this, I want to challenge you and Kevin on this approach. So it sounds like that, you and Kevin have, kind of more focused on pushing a problem forward. I want to understand, do you find yourself, I mean, so you don't fully get the chance to see your type 2 errors here, but do you, I think in general, one of the things with sort of whether it's brain teasers, stats problems, or problems with really clear definitive answers, you do get a sense of whether the person got it right or wrong. How do you do with type 1 and type 2 errors here? So how do you do, really for either of you? I think if you're a seasoned interviewer, or if you kind of know what you want, or you have these problems, that's maybe a little bit easier. How do you? I mean, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you just need to have a conversation with somebody and see if they can push your thinking forward. What do you find yourself in terms of call it type 1 type errors, with this approach?
So I guess I should clarify that I think of a problem that is related to the work that we're doing at my company, and I do ask that to many candidates. So it's not like I'm changing that question every single time, because I do think it's important to have a baseline and a rubric, an idea of okay, these are the different directions people go, and this is what a good and a not as good answer is. So for me, I want it to be related to the domain of things that they would be working on, but I do have some standardization of what that question is.
Yeah,
go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I would do similar, right? When I'd ask these questions, it would usually be the thing at the top of my wish list that never made it onto the product roadmap. But I always so a question I used to ask for years was integrating weather data into Uber ETA forecasts, right? It's actually something they've since done in the last year or two, but just let's think through where we would get this information, how we would integrate it, where are the gotchas. But Fish, going back to your question on the interview process, the other thing I would say that clarifies that I think enables this kind of late stage interviewing is about halfway through, we would have people do a very standardized, relatively simple, but standardized take-home test that had 3 functional parts, right? So one, and actually this has since been leaked online, so you can just Google Uber data science take-home if you want to copy my exact take-home exam. But it always had 3 parts. One was you are given a set of sort of prototypical SQL schema. Please write 3 to 5 queries that achieve this sort of desired outcome. and you're like just graded on SQL syntax. Part 2 would be, I think it was like an experimental design question. You know, we have like, you know, it was like design a simple A/B test, you're given this sort of problem scenario. And problem 3 was usually involved like a simple Python script. We targeted like 150 lines, maybe 200 lines or less. You know, the right answer would enable you to do, and there would be a like a, you know, 3 paragraphs of text. And all of those were super standardized. So we knew by the time we got on site that they could at least write, you know, SQL queries of 30 lines or less, Python scripts of 200 lines or less, and at least could, you know, crib Google well enough to design a plausible sounding A/B test, which enabled it to be a little bit more, once we had that baseline, enabled it to be more problem solving skills. How do we communicate with each other? How do you sort of integrate with like the company as it is now? So I think that that certainly, I think led to more, first of all, standardized take-homes were far more scalable to grade. In fact, like the whole organization at one point was grading take-homes, which made my recruiting process a lot more scalable. But then the on-site allowed it to be a little bit more problem-oriented than less skill assessment.
Makes sense. Colin, do you have sort of a take here?
Yeah, I mean, so 2 things, just going back to like hiring your first person. I think like first, everything that we're talking about here is the reason why it's so hard to hire your first data scientist, because they're going to know so much more about their domain than anyone in your company that it can get very tricky to actually figure out what's good and what's not. And like you're going to build these processes over time that help solve those things. I think going back to like the super junior person versus the more senior person, some of the benefit of going really junior is that I don't want to say you can make a mistake, but you can move a little bit more quickly hiring the first person, understand what's working and what's not, and sort of develop either that person into a leader or find a leader that can sort of, that person can help identify a little bit better. Inversely, like if you're trying to hire a leader of a data person, like a player coach, a lot of it is just going to be like, what have you done at your previous job? And tell me about that. And their ability to communicate that effectively is usually a pretty good indication of how good sort of how effective they're going to be immediately. If they can talk about sort of business outcomes and what they've built, that's a person that's going to be able to effectively build a data org and do data work because they can accurately describe the types of things that they're doing. But I think it can be challenging to press too hard on sort of quantitative skills if you don't have people already that are quantitative enough to evaluate those things. So that's, I think going back to the academic versus non-academic, I think because I spent so much time at Google before, biased, I think, against academics a little bit, honestly. Just because I think that risk of not understanding the business can be high. I agree that like almost the failed academic can be a really nice profile because it's someone who maybe is looking for a little bit more business focus and a little bit less academic focus. But I think the most important thing is just for any of these profiles, understanding the weakness of the person. So for the academic, it's going to be understanding the business, like caring about CAC and LTV and like businessy metrics and whether that matters to the person or whether they want to build data products. For the consultant, it's going to be doing things scalably and actually developing a good foundation for what you need. So I just think it's really important to contextualize, like you can have a preferred profile, but know what the weak point is and press at that a little bit, because anyone can test if an academic kind of wants to do businessy things or wants to do research. And similarly, you can see whether someone wants to sort of hammer everything in Excel versus build scalable pipelines and like actually try to structure things. So that's kind of the way that I'd frame it. But anytime you're hiring a person into a role that you don't have, they're going to have some slight advantage because they know that role and you don't.
So we've started from a place of like things that would be awesome to have in this person. Where does this person come from? Where does a pipeline or a funnel for this person come from? We all came from very, one of the reasons that we're on this panel is we've done this job at, fancy tech companies that have had, big versions of this team and, generally have like massively advantageous compensation packages and other, and, brand names to recruit these folks. Where, how do you recruit these folks without those advantages? How do you think about kind of, how do you think about kind of where to look in a way, it's one thing, if I'm at Google and I have to, hire this, this set of people, well, Google should be top of mind for many people for a number of reasons. But how do I think about it if I'm not at Google?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can start with where it shouldn't come from, and this will be a little bit my own bias. Asking your investors to do your data sourcing for you is a recipe for a lot of disappointment, right? In that, lots of, and I say this as an investor because so many VCs are promising recruiting help. And so the way you can utilize your investors, I think, to get, especially data investors, to speed up your pipeline is, like Colin, you mentioned, if you're not quantitative, it's hard to assess quantitative skills a little bit. I tell all my portfolio companies, like, find your operator investors, find your data and or secure like a data science advisor and use those people to cross-cut your own like quantitative blind spot. So they're super helpful in assessing skills, interviewing, mid-stage strategy. But from sourcing, like, I run a portfolio of 36 companies. Even if I only source for the top 20% of my companies, that means I'm sourcing for 7 companies simultaneously, right? You as a founder get 1/7 of my sourcing bandwidth. That is just a functionally less useful channel than if you're doing it on your own. But if I can help you increase your on-site conversion from 1 in 10 to 1 in 3, then it's massive value to be unlocked. So it's not saying don't utilize data investors, but use them for more interviewing and sourcing.
Yeah, good funnel as opposed to top of funnel. I think, like, I'm curious, separately, I'd love to know if you think that applies to other roles or data specifically. So should I, I mean, should I call you about a sales and marketing role, or should I,
I mean, it never hurts to ask. And what can be helpful for any investor is on the close or on the like, look, we're getting really excited about this person. We want to make sure they get excited. Bringing in a like third party, like, we're obviously not a third party if I've invested in your company, but getting them to hear 5 or 10 minutes about why I parted with a lot of currency to get involved in this company can be a very persuasive pitch. So I think when in doubt, call and ask people. But if the lens is, I want to hire somebody who's ahead of blank and I'm not very good at blank, so help me sort of cover this blind spot, find an investor who's specialized in that function you're hiring for.
And Jess, like, if you were to think about kind of, so if we rule out investors, what are your sort of favorite places to go? I call it to go fishing, but that's me. What are some of your favorite places to think about kind of hires or early hires?
Yeah, so one company I was the 4th employee, and another I was the 10th employee, and neither of those companies had brand recognition. And so it wasn't as easy as when I was at Microsoft or Slack to like get people to return my emails. We found that leveraging personal connections was where we got a large number of our early hires. And there is challenges with that because that can be bias your pool or have like, too much people from the same types of backgrounds. But it is much more effective if you have somebody who you have a personal connection with that is introducing you to someone. There's that level of trust. Be like, okay, this is actually a legit company in person, not just some, fly-by-night thing. So that's been really effective for me. And so even though like networking is, not always fun, I try to keep involved in like alumni channels, Slack channels of other organizations I've been in, and like have a community of data scientists that I can like reach out to when I'm hiring, to try to like get those personal referrals of folks that might give my unknown company a second look that otherwise that they wouldn't if I just cold reached out to them without that introduction.
And Colin, some additional channels or channels that you think of?
Yeah, I mean, definitely +1 to the network. Like, you need to tap the place where you have unfair advantage. And the first place that you have unfair advantage is like the people that are already involved in your company. I think depending on the profile, like if you're trying to hire a leader, go look at similar companies and go talk to the people on those teams. Like, they have experience in the product area. That's a really easy inbound if you believe in your company and you can pitch people on it. If you're looking for more junior people, like at Looker, we had a lot of success tapping alumni networks and local sort of colleges for more junior talent for sure, but talent that we could develop. So like if you're looking for that more junior persona, like look at the alumni in your first 10 employees and start reaching out, because there's going to be a lot of talented people that maybe it's hard for that group to get connected to a startup. There was no Looker doing on-site interviews at local colleges, just like we don't have that program in place. But once we hired one person from UC Santa Cruz, which is where Looker was based, we started hiring like a third of the math class into the company, because it was just like a unfair advantage talent network that we could tap. So for the first one, it's tough to do anything except network, but look for people that are already doing it. Like that's a really easy version. And then just make sure that you're properly sort of referencing that the work is of high quality.
Yeah, I'd say universally.
Go for it, Kevin.
I was going to say that, to just dogpile on referrals, have always been our highest converting channel. What we did is took it a step further and organized events, organized even our expense policy around creating and manufacturing more personal connections, right? So like I ran like a data seminar series. In fact, Fish, I think you spoke at one of our first ones, and it was, one, I just love hearing your dulcet tones, but two, it was like this reason and opening for us to just bring, I told every data scientist, like find 10 people who you are like loosely affiliated with and just use this as an opportunity to like get them in the building. Let's have some fun. I tended to be pretty generous or pretty tolerant for like what people would expense. If it was sort of in the name of recruiting, I had one data scientist who ran a D&D campaign on Uber's dime that was leading to like referrals. I sent data scientists, even our first year where we had literally nothing to say to the community, I would send data scientists to conferences with the goal of just meet people, talk to people, get out of your shell. All trying to and I think what that does, just to your point, I think the downside here is referrals lead to bias, and you tend to get more of like hiring like. So if you cross-cut that with sort of a lot of kind of forced manufacturing or sort of intentional manufacturing of networks, sometimes you can mitigate that sort of demographic bias. But yeah, I'd say spend money from the top-down perspective. Encourage your employees to use a little bit of the company's money.
The answer that I hate the most here is spend the money, but it tends to be right. I do want to switch to Q&A. So again, thanks so much for attending, for participating. I want to dive into a couple of these that are open. So Kimberly asked a question: as a person who is stepping into the data role at a mid-level startup, and having to manage data analysts, what advice would you give? And how would this person be able to eventually transition to a data role at another tech company, maybe a larger one, that would be a lot more structured? And I've ping-ponged between sort of, early stage, mid stage, late stage, big public. So, they are very different. I'd be curious any of your perspectives on that. Maybe Colin, you could dive in, sort of going data role at a mid-stage startup and managing. What advice do you have for this person?
I mean, the first thing to think about when you start managing is just obviously getting the muscle to recruit and build teams. I think that's probably the hardest thing to start doing, is actually hiring people. So a lot of the advice I think here is probably very applicable to thinking about sort of what does your team look like? What kind of skills are you trying to develop and things like that? In terms of like sort of transitioning, I definitely think creating expertise in certain areas is a really effective way to develop yourself. So there are people that are going to have biases towards marketing or finance or some area of the business. I think in a lot of really young companies, you're doing everything. You're sort of average at a lot of different types of analysis, and sort of your flexibility is your main advantage. The biggest difference at a larger company is you're going to be way more specialized. So like the quality of your SQL is going to need to be better, and your ability to sort of guide a much larger project and sort of advocate for yourself, right? Those sorts of skills become a lot more important. So it's really just like in my opinion, it's an act of like sort of formalizing your role more, and sort of moving from a place where you're going quickly and just making things happen to creating more structure and process and communicating more effectively. But I'd kind of defer to the others too.
So I actually want to hop to another question that Celia had, which is basically it touches really closely to that sort of more junior persona that we were talking about. So her question was, how do you evaluate the candidate's quantitative skills? What are some red flags? And then, you know, we sort of hinted at this, and it's really important we should call it out. In hiring a junior person, how can you make sure that they're getting the right mentorship within the organization they might be the only person that's effectively in this specific data function. So Jess, maybe having been super early at some places, what's your take on either of the two?
So when I'm advising folks who are trying to find their first data role, I discourage them from being the first data person at a small company. I just think that you get so much value from when you're transitioning to a new type of job of being with more seasoned people who can help you learn the ropes. So like Fish was my first boss, and I'm so glad that I had that experience and didn't go straight to a startup or my first hire. That said, if you decide to hire someone who's more junior or who's coming from a slightly different experience, it is important for you to have a sense of like what are the most important skills that you need? Do you need someone who's going to build some pipelines for you or set up a data warehouse? Like that's a very specific set of technical skills versus somebody who's just going to take a bunch of like, Google Analytics reports and like use them, interpret them. That's a different skill set. And so knowing that and having that in mind, and then creating an interview that will test those specific skills is important.
Okay. If we have time, I want to come back to this one, but I actually want to ask the next question of Kevin, which is, it's a question about a seed stage startup that's looking at potentially hiring a data consultant. You must have companies that are sort of going this route or going this approach. What do you think about the hire a consultant approach versus like, as in somebody with some data expertise versus sort of bringing that skill in-house in a permanent sort of ongoing burn perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think when possible, in-house is always better than consultant, in that the typical sort of data analysis workflow is almost never a closed-end project, in that usually doing an analysis problem answers 2 questions and creates 3 more, and you kind of create this sort of linked list of projects, all of which are sort of serving a larger meta goal. So in the perfect world where financial constraints are not real, and you're saying, look, I have enough work to keep a data consultant busy, you probably have enough work to keep a full-time hire busy. That being said, we do not live in the perfect world and financial constraints come in. So I have seen people involve data consultants. And my advice would be, if you're doing it, be really clear on what the outcome is. And it usually should be tied to something around a fundraise, right? That we need to, unlock 25% customer, sign up growth rate. I need them to explore the following, 3 to 5 specific channels and give me a stack rank of these 5 channels, which should we spend money on or not. And I need it by Q1 so I can spend the money in Q2 so I can fundraise in Q4, right? Like that, literally tie it up that explicitly. And ideally you're raising with the idea of either going back to that consultant and seeing if they want to join you full-time after your next raise, or at least laying the ground of like, okay, now I'm going to hire a full-time person after my next fundraise. And this will be sort of the work to date, which is their jumping off point.
Great. Now we're a little over 10 minutes over, but I want to go back to the second question, which I think had something. How do you mentor a data person within an organization if you don't have that function today? And this is, really for anyone. I'll start it with Colin. Like, where does that mentorship come from? Or, I mean, it doesn't have to be a specific title, but
yeah,
where do you see that coming from?
So like, I think there's two perfectly honest answers here that are probably not going to be very appealing to people. So at some level, you don't. Like, if you don't have other data people in your organization, I think to Jess's point, the person's not going to get mentorship around doing data work. They will get organizational mentorship. So like, if they're doing a lot of financial analysis, they're going to get mentorship from your VP of finance on what the finance org looks like. Or if they're working with marketing, they're going to build expertise there. They're not going to, this is the reality of early stage startups, is like the mentorship is doing work and developing that way. You're not going to learn the same way that you would in a Google or a Microsoft. So this is where you need to be mindful of what you're trying to get out of that person. If you're trying to hire a junior person that is looking to develop hard skills in a data organization, they're being set up for failure. Like, that's a person that's going to come in and be scrappy and sort of learn on the fly in a very non-formalized way. And they're going to pick up a lot of business sort of concepts. So you need to be really careful about if a person is expecting a lot of sort of help and oversight. And like, certainly they can pick that up on data pipelines and stuff like that, and like maybe get help from an engineering team building a data warehouse, but that it's not coming. So you need to be really mindful about what you expect that person to do.
Great. Jess?
This is an area where I think academics do have the training to take something that they don't know and figure out the resources out there to learn it. And so academics can be very good here at like researching best practices and figuring it out. I also have myself and recommended other people to like leverage mentorship outside of their organization. So you can get connected to other folks that your investors have relationships with, the data science lead at another company, or through other mentoring and relationship and meetup programs. So I do that for like women in data, because that are lower down in their, or earlier in their career than me. And so like finding that support outside of your organization can also be quite helpful.
Well, obviously we've run over. I'm very thankful that I got the opportunity to speak with you all about hiring, a first data analyst. We at Mozart Data are obviously very passionate about getting people started on their data journey, and I enjoyed the conversation today. Handing it back to Cody.
Yeah, thank you to all of our panelists, and then if you attended this, thank you so much. We hope this was valuable to you. We're going to be sending an email out, so if you want to go back to anything, there's going to be a recording. So you can, come back to something that somebody said that might have been valuable. And we also have an ebook on the topic that is, quite similar, and you can find that on our website under our resources section. And hopefully that would also be something of interest to you guys. But thank you again so much.